welcome to our presenter, to everyone here, and to our presenter, Gretchen Crabb, who is an occupational therapist. But I will let her introduce herself and get going with this month's Exploring Quality in Family Childcare.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you so much for everybody here today. So again, I'm Gretchen Becker-Crabb. I'm an occupational therapist. I am a licensed professional mental health counselor, a certified lactation counselor, as well as an endorsed infant mental health therapist. So my roots are in home visiting and birth of 3, as well as preschool. So I started my career as a preschool teacher, and now have the distinct honor of doing consultation for preschools all around the Dane County area, including Reach Dane. So that's who I am. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about visual processing. We're going to be talking about visual environments and how that impacts child development, as well as a lot of different strategies that you can consider in your home. So some of our objectives today are to understand the definition of visual clutter. I'm going to add to that. We're also going to talk about visual processing. We're going to talk about visual clutter and the impact of that on children's development. We're also going to take some time to talk about typical visual development from birth, and then how that relates to environment. And then we're going to talk lots about how to think about materials and how to plan and use space in your home in order to help promote visual development. I should say, if at any time you have questions, you can always put them in the chat, and then we'll be, hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions as well. So please feel free to not just sit here and listen to me lecture the whole time. But what I would love to do is start with a little bit of a visual mindfulness. And this is just a little simple thing that I think that we can do. We can encourage our children to do. As long as they're like old enough to understand the words that we're saying and how to follow that. But this is a really great thing that you can do for yourselves, is just a break when you need it in your day. So what I encourage you to do is just to start looking around your environment and really move your head, like move your head up and down, look to the side, look behind you, just kind of see what you notice. And as you're doing that, I just try to focus in on something that really catches your eye, like catches your vision, that brings you joy. So what I would like you to do is just, I won't say anything for about a minute here, but what I would like you to do is just focus on that one visual thing that brings you joy, and just notice some details about it. Notice the texture. Notice the colors. Notice the shape. And as you do that, also notice what's happening inside for you. Is there a memory that's being evoked? Is there a sensation that you feel somewhere in your body? Is there emotion that's brought up when you look at this object? And we're just going to be with that for like a minute. Okay, I'm going to encourage you just to take one deep breath, and just to know that you can access that feeling just by looking at that object. I'm going to share mine with you. Mine was Unikitty from the Lego movie. If any of you have seen that Lego movie, and Unikitty changes emotions and feelings really intensively. With this one, she's in her happy stage. So I'm just going to call that to you, just that you know that you can use that at any moment, and to encourage children in your classroom to do the same. So, and before I go on, what I do want to also just bring to mind and mention is that we're going to be talking about a lot of different strategies today. And I want just to note that what is valued across cultures can vary. So I'm really going to encourage you to take whatever you feel sticks with you today, and really make it your own. And so just because I suggest something doesn't mean it's right or wrong necessarily. It just means that it's an idea, it's an example. But what I'd really like you to do is make it, think about your own cultural values around vision and visual environments, and think about how that may be the same and how that may be different for some of the children in your classroom. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today is visual development. What does that look like, and why is it important? So when babies are born, we're going to go, basically what we're going to do is I'm going to bring you through newborn till about 5, okay? And so what we'll do is we'll go through each stage, and as we do that, I will talk to you more about what is usually expected at that age, what newborns and children can see, and then just kind of some basic considerations that you might want to think about when it comes to things like toys or things that might be important to them visually at that stage. So a newborn, which is fascinating, right? This is about what a newborn can see. A newborn baby can see large shapes and objects. They can see a little bit of a super bright color, usually red, because red is the same color as inside of the womb, and that's what they're exposed to. But generally, they see everything on like a black and white type of pattern. They can only see up till about 12 inches, which is from an evolution standpoint, which is amazing, because if you think about holding an infant and feeding them, whether at the breast, the body, the bottle, it's about 12 inches from your face. So that is what infants can see, and that's what's important for them. They prefer human faces over and very basic patterns, predictable patterns, over anything else. What's fascinating is there's been research studies done that say between 12 to 36 hours after birth, a newborn can tell the difference and will focus more on the face of their birthing parent versus a face of somebody that is not related to them. Isn't that fascinating? Like, that is so cool. So everything about newborns is about relationship. It's about building capacity, and it's about understanding the human face. That is all that they need. At about 1 to 2 months of development, you can see from the pictures here, so 4 weeks to 8 weeks, right? 1 to 2 months. You can see that the forms and the shapes of what they're starting to see is a teeny bit clearer. And you can also notice that they start seeing faint examples of color. Their visual tracking starts emerging. Up until this point, oftentimes babies can still visually track at the newborn stage prior to 1 month, but their eyes will kind of sometimes do this funky thing where one will go in one direction and the other one will go the other, and it's fairly inconsistent. But consistent visual tracking with both eyes happens at about 1 to 2 months, and babies can start to see at about, for sure, at 12 inches, but up to about 18 inches. But really, this is what they need. They really need facial interaction. They love human face over lights, over patterns, over anything like that. They will always go and almost always prefer human face and human interaction. This is really important. We also know that infants at about a couple of days old can start imitating facial patterns. This is how they learn their social skills. This is how they learn about the world. This is how they develop attachment and who they can trust. So it's so critical to their development. At about 3 to 4 months, we start noticing improved eye coordination and emerging hand-eye coordination. So thinking about things at this stage that babies can start to reach for, and this is very, they're not going to necessarily hold on and grasp for it. It's going to be kind of emerging. So they're going to start noticing that my hands and my eyes are somewhat connected. You can also notice that they're going to start noticing some more definition of shape, right? And more color, as you can see in this example. Part of the reason why this happens in this way is thankfully because of our asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. So babies from about 18 weeks in utero start to develop this skill. It's fully present at birth. It actually is one of the birthing reflexes that help to move a baby down the birth canal. And it's fully integrated after 6 months after birth, which means that you don't see this reflex anymore. But what this reflex is every time an infant or a baby turns their head to one side, their arms automatically go into this fencer-like position, as you can see here in the picture and what I'm demonstrating as well. They're sort of stuck in that position until their heads turn to midline and they turn to the other way, and then the opposite happens. And the reason for this is because this is how that hand-eye development happens. When their hands are out to the side, their eyes are automatically connected to their hands and they can see what's happening at their hands. This is also how babies start developing their own sense of self. How much space do I take up in the world? What does my container of self look like? What does that feel like? They start to develop that sense through this reflex. At 6 months after birth, you don't see this reflex anymore. Hopefully, if you turn your head, if any of us turn our heads really quick, we don't go into that position. Though we may, if there's something that startles us, right? So it comes out every once in a while, but usually after 6 months, you can turn your head freely and you can move your hands in different ways. But up until then, it's very difficult for babies to do that. Then at about 5 to 8 months, we start noticing some really significant shifts. At 5 months, a baby can see up to 15 feet. At 6 months, they can see up to 30 feet, which is like huge, right? That they can develop that amount of visual acuity in such a short period of time. It's also the time where they start developing depth perception or better sensory experiences of near and far. They also start developing more 3D perception. So you can see in this toy now that started off as this black and white blob is now very clearly a circle with smaller little circles on it, and you can sense the depth of how close it is to you, how far away it is from you, and about the shape that it takes. So children in this age, if you think about what they're doing developmentally, they're starting to sit, right? And they're starting to feed. They're starting to do more of this like hand-mouth coordination. They're starting to be able to sit up more on their own and start to explore a little bit more with more complexity. So toys and things like that to explore at this age would be those like beautiful little, I don't have one handy, those, they're called O-rings. So they're balls that have like little like holes inside of them. Very simple peekaboo is great at this age because kids are starting to understand near and far and depth perception, or I'm here and I'm not. So those types of things can start to emerge in children's play at this time. Even simple things like this is where they start doing the whole like, I'm going to play with my fork and tap it, and then I'm going to toss it, right? That's exactly what we want them to see. That's exactly what we want to see them doing, or taking their food and dropping it off of their high chair. They're developing depth perception when they do those types of activities. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy, right? It just has with the opportunities for them to explore some of these concepts. If we can present that to them, then we start seeing that development in that area. At about 9 to 12 months, right, they start walking and crawling and exploring their world a little bit more. That near and far, that becomes much more prevalent. And we also start seeing more development of depth perception with movement. So when they start to crawl, they start to see the world in a different perspective than they do if they're just static sitting. When they stand, it brings on a whole nother level of integration as well. It also comes along with more complexity and balance. So your vision is directly tied to your vestibular system, which is directly tied to your postural control. Anybody who's ever experienced vertigo in this group, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like if you have vertigo, which usually starts to integrate in your inner ears, it's difficult to see. Like things may look blurry or not look well coordinated. Or vice versa, if you've ever like watched like an IMAX movie and you're watching Star Wars or something and you're flying through space and you close your eyes, you still feel like you're moving, right? That's the connection between movement and vision. And so babies at about 9 to 12 months really start to play with this skill because they have to figure out what their postural control is in relationship to their vision. Things to be thinking about at this stage is really, you know, like ball rolling. This is when that stuff comes into play where you throw a ball and baby becomes really excited and starts crawling or walking over to that ball and picking it up and bringing it back to you. They start exploring more of their space as well. They start to get a better idea of environmental space and time as well, and how long and distance between themselves and other objects or people. Okay, what I'm going to do now is just show you a very brief video from BuzzFeed about what the first year of visual development can look like. Let's get past that one. All right. I love that video because I think it just like so beautifully in a simple way really shows like how the importance of visual development, especially within the first year. And I don't know if you caught that at the end, that a baby's visual acuity is basically that of an adult at 12 months of age. So like fascinating, right? That like that is also, if you think about like how motor development occurs throughout the lifespan, the fact that the vision develops so intensely and so quickly is also a reflection of how important it is. So at about 1.5 to 2 years, we start noticing that again, kiddos have very clear distance vision. Their fine motor starts to develop. This is where block stacking comes in. This is where like I'm learning how to maybe like start to put on my coat and do all those things. They're also able to identify body parts, which again is really like, remember when I was talking about ETNR and like sense of self and others, this is also a really important part of visual development as well. So things at this stage, that we're promoting are again like black stacking and shape sorting, and you can see how like more complexity comes into the play, more so than like the development of acuity and the development of color vision. And then finally in the preschool years, so this is about 4 to 5 or 3 to 5 years old, baby or infant toddlers, sorry, start navigating more complex visual environments. So they can handle a little bit more complexity. Their distance is again nearing 2020. They have identification of more complex patterns like letters and numbers and symbols that can start to define those things. We see increase in fine and gross motor refinement and complexity. So they're starting to be able to play soccer, kick a ball, or cut with scissors and start to draw themselves. We're noticing all of this develop. Fascinating little fact here is that when children start drawing, they're only usually able to draw in themselves what it is that they can perceive. That's why as you start when children start drawing pictures of themselves, it's usually, just like a big head and a little body, because that's what they perceive of themselves. As they begin to improve their visual perception, as they start to improve all of their other senses that are developing, you start to see more refinement in their drawings. I should also say that most visual development is fully established by 5 to 7 years of age. So these first early years are critical in thinking about visual development and offering opportunities that meet the child where they're at developmentally. So let's get into now, let's talk a little bit about sensory processing. So sensory processing is fully related to everything that we were just talking about. But when it comes to visual processing, what we're talking about is more around how vision interacts with all of the other senses, but also how well we're able to filter out important and unimportant visual information from the environment. Now, I love this graphic. This was a graphic that was done by Lucy Jane Miller, who gave me permission to share. Lucy Jane Miller is an occupational therapist in Colorado who does a lot of research on sensory processing. And if you look at this visual, you see that relationships and engagement are at the foundation of everything that we do. In infant mental health, there's a saying that goes, "There's no such thing as a baby." And what we mean by that is that a baby can't survive in this world without another human to take care of it, right? I'm going to argue that we need that for all of us, but but especially in that infant phase of development. You can see going up from there, you see all of our 8 senses: gustatory, olfactory, so sense of taste, sense of smell, vision, auditory, proprioception, which is the input that we get through our muscles and our joints that tell us where we are in space, vestibular, which is our sense of balance, coordination, interoception, the sense that we get from ourselves internally, as well as our tactile processing or touch. So all of these 8 senses are at the foundation of everything else that you see on this triangle or this inverted triangle, including the things that I think that we think about the most as preschool teachers, like memory, regulated interactions, social participation, emotional control, ideation, creativity. All of those things are based in sensory processing. If one or more areas of sensory processing aren't working quite as effectively for that child, then it impacts everything else on this triangle. So I hope that you see that just from here, the importance of looking at sensory. Again, we're looking at visual today, but looking at all of the senses and how we perceive that and the impact that it has on our development. Again, visual processing in particular is our ability to be able to filter out important versus irrelevant visual input from our environment. So if you think about, like, I think one of the most complex visual tasks of driving, um, think about how many things you have to pay attention to, and think about how many things you try to filter out. So if you're driving down the street, hopefully what you're doing is you're paying attention to the other cars and, any other objects that might be coming into the road, where you're going to go, where you're navigating. Hopefully you're not like looking up in the sky and looking at all those pretty blue jays that are flying around, right? Like, even though all of those things are in your visual environment, you have an idea of what it is that's most important, for you to focus on. That is visual processing. It also helps with imitation and attachment, as we had talked about earlier. There's also direct vagal connections. So our vagal nerve is a very important part of our ability to be able to self-regulate. And the best example that I have of that would be if you think about going out to dinner with somebody that you really care about, and the lighting is low and the candles are lit, and you're like, like all googly eyed around them. Like, and you feel so good inside. That is how visual processing has an impact on your regulatory abilities. I can converse to that, and I can speak for myself. I am somebody who tends to run more on the hypervisual or the hypersensitive part of the side of the visual spectrum, which basically means I just need a little bit of visual input for that to be processed. If there's too much for me, I become easily overwhelmed. So I am somebody, as an example, who, if I'm working at my desk and I'm really needing to focus, nothing else can be on the desk. Because if there is, I'm going to be like, oh, that, or Instagram, right? Like, I am going to be pulled in so many different ways. So I have to make sure that my visual space is cleared, right? But that is an example of somebody who's more hypersensitive. And so that helps me to regulate. If I walked into my house and I really had to work on something really important, and there's like stuff all over my desk, and the kids left all their backpacks strewn about as I walk in the door and things like that, it's going to be way more difficult for me to be able to focus on what I need to focus on, because my brain has a difficult time processing what's important and what isn't to focus on. There are direct ties to our visual processing, to our vestibular system, again, to our sense of movement, and our postural control and balance. I talked about that a little bit before here as well. I should also mention that there are individuals who are hyposensitive to visual processing, and all of these are great. None of these are pathological, good or bad, or in between. It's just how we're created as humans. And hyposensitivity to visual means that you are somebody who likely loves bright colors and has to have a lot of visual information in your environment. And really, you're probably somebody who has like lots of different piles of things on your desk. And if I asked you, hey, where are your like 1099 tax forms, you'd be able to be like, oh, halfway down that stack right there. You organize your visual system in a slightly different way. And again, there's no pros and cons to that. It's just what it is that works best for you. So just knowing that there's a range of how people process visually is really important to know. So reflecting a little bit on what are your visual preferences. So I'm showing in this slide, like an example of an environment that's pretty basic, right? And another example of an environment that has lots of different colors, lots of different patterns, lots of the different visual stimulation that are happening within that environment. All of us in this room might look at one of these and say, oh, I feel drawn to this. And somebody else might be like, oh, I'm drawn to like the intensity, right? And I think that it's really important to take some time and think about what's visually important for you, because that is what helps us to figure out how your visual processing may be the same or different than some of the needs and preferences to some of the children in your program, right? So taking a deep dive and really looking around your space and really being objective around like, oh, here are things that I like. I'm somebody who likes to wear bright patterns and bright colors, and I like bright colors in my environment. If that is somebody that you tend to do those things, what might that be like for a child in your environment who's visually hypersensitive, who like bright colors and bright lights are really overwhelming to? Or, and how do we navigate those differences? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Then we have visual clutter, right? Visual clutter is, there's actually a definition for this that refers to the abundance of items, colors, textures, and patterns in a space that can lead to sensory overload. So this is more than just liking bright colors. This is something that happens when it's hard to discern what's happening within that area. So you can kind of see here, there's this little kiddo here playing at the kitchen, but where are the kitchen things? What might she use in the kitchen? She's going to have to think really hard, and she's going to have to think in a more complex way to start to associate what usually happens or what tools she could be using in that space. What I will say, oh, sorry, I'm going to go back one slide here. What I will say about visual clutter and what we know about visual clutter is it can impact emotional and sensory regulation, right? If you don't know what it is that you're supposed to focus on, again, like I said, your brain kind of works double time to figure out what's important here, because I don't really know. Everything kind of looks important. That can lead to irritability. It can lead to restlessness. It can lead to difficulties in sleep and a brain that just can't shut down. I'm sure that all of you have experienced this at some point or another. Like if you are really having an intense day, and then somebody is like, "Oh, will you come here on the computer and look at this like really complex calculus problem that I have to figure out?" You're like, "Oh my gosh, I can't handle one more thing." That can be a result of sensory overload, but can also be a result of visual overload as well. Visual clutter also impacts concentration and focus. There's too many things to think about, and it's too difficult sometimes to focus on one specific thing. It can lead to accidents, right? Like, especially for children who are just learning to develop their depth perception and their ability to crawl and walk. It's going to be really difficult for them to maneuver unpredictable spaces. And then sometimes it can also lead to difficulties with organizational skills. So, right. So sometimes we do cleanup in maybe some of your homes, you do like the cleanup times after children have, free playtime and things like that. The importance of that not only is can be helpful for you to know where everything is, right? And for the children to know where everything is, but it can also be because it teaches children basic organizational skills. And that leads to, how do I organize my thoughts? How do I organize my environment? How do I organize this really complex, AP English exam someday when that child is a senior in high school? All of that starts in these early developmental years. And that's when it comes to sensory co-regulation. So, right, that's the asterisk here. That's the big ask, is how do we navigate different visual systems within environments where there's up to 10 children or 8 children and 2 adults? How do you regulate that, knowing that everybody has different sensory systems and different ways of processing that they rely on? So my first answer to that, or my first thought around that, is supportive spaces. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of supportive spaces today: womb spaces, parent spaces, and kid power spaces. Now, the importance of these 3 spaces are, you can take this from a developmental standpoint, and you can take it from thinking about your environment right now. And do you have examples of these 3 spaces in your environment? Because these 3 spaces will not only help to promote development, but they're also going to help to promote sensory regulation for children. So the first is womb spaces, which is exactly what it sounds like. We're trying to replicate what the womb would be like. This means minimal visual input and the spaces are cozy and defined. So you can see here, this first example of this child in the blanket. This is just a blanket that's tied over over a table, right? How simple is that? But it creates this little cozy swing of sorts. Um, and it minimizes the visual input that's happening around that child. Another way, if you work with much younger children, having small little like those little like blocks that you can have, or moving a chair so it's like so it blocks a corner, like that can create a cute little room space for a child as well. And it's a really simple way to do it. If you work with really, really young children, this is what baby wearing is all about, right? It's cozy, it's defined, it's predictable. Best for children when it's quiet time, and also best for children if you think about the developmental stages again, that newborn to about 5 months of age. You want to, if that's the demographic of children you're working with, you really want to make sure that a lot of your spaces evoke that cozy, minimal environment, like visual type of input, right? Because we're working with their developmental stages. This is an example. I have to credit Denise Merkin from Honeybees for sharing these with me. This is how Denise used to set up her nap time spaces. But you can see that this is like the envelopment of a womb space. It's clearly defined. It's small, it's cozy. There's not a lot of visual input. And then we have parent spaces. So if you think about it, parent spaces are developmentally from about 8 months when children start to crawl to about a year to year and a half of age when they start to walk and explore their environment. So the visual environment is still fairly minimal, but it increases slightly in complexity, and it's usually about it's usually less than 10 yards. So it's not very far that they have to go. I would say maybe even less than that, maybe about 5 yards. But you can see in each of these pictures where, like in the top one, you can imagine like sitting on one part of this little path, and the children could explore and then come back. But it's defined, it's more complex than a womb space would be, but it still offers that sort of back and forth exploration, as well as the two that you see down here, like a little cozy area. So there's more room for movement. It's not so tight in like that little swing, but it's still cozy, right? Or using like forts and sheets and things like that to hang, just to create small little spaces where children can go and feel free to explore, but then come back to you when they're feeling like they need a check-in. So it's not only helpful visually, but it's also helpful emotionally for children that age. Okay, I'm going to again give you an example from Honeybees in a space that Denise used to have that was called the Hive, that I think is a beautiful representation of a parent space.
This area is called the Hive, and many times all 8 children are in here together. The paintings on the wall were done by one of my teachers, and it's each season of the year. Children can bring whatever they want to into the hive. They usually choose to bring cushions and blankets and pillows and pretend that it's nap time and pretend that they're taking care of their babies. They really love to wrap their babies up and put pillows under their head. And then sometimes they just lie down. It takes them a long time to gather all the materials, and then the babies are sleeping for a long time. And whenever I ask them why their babies are sleeping so long, they say because they're working so hard.
I love that then. The babies are sleeping so long because they're working so hard, right? It's such a beautiful parallel to likely what's happening for the children in that are sharing that space as well. So not that you need a fancy little hive, right? But thinking about your environment and thinking about ways to create that parent space. It could even be as simple, and one of the most effective ways that I've used myself to do this is just if I'm sitting with a child and I like put my legs out and the child just kind of plays with their toys within the space that I create for them. That is a beautiful little parent space as well. I'm not holding on to them necessarily, but they're free and it's defined, right? So those are just examples of parent space. And then finally, we have kid power spaces. So kid power spaces are if we think about it like that, 3 to 5 and beyond. The visual environment could be more complex. It might be more expanse, so more places for them to go and explore. And sometimes can involve movement with vision. So if you see this child here, like on the who created this little like, ramp for himself. He had to like build that himself, and then he has to figure out how to move down it. So the visual complexity of doing something like that from a sensory perspective is way more intense. But it also offers lots of different opportunities. You can see on the right side here, like an example of a play gym that's inside, right? So especially helpful on those rainy days and all of those and snowy days where you might not always be able to get outside. But you can see how there's a womb space created as well inside of a kid power area as well. Same thing for the loft on the left. I will say that what happens with these spaces is to think about it again, thinking about the spaces that you want to create based on the ages of the children and their developmental stages in your program. But also especially if the children in your program are like 3 to 5 years old, that you have all of these spaces available, right? And us as adults, we work through all of these spaces too. Like I sometimes would love to go to farmers market, right? And like see all the things and smell all the things, and because farmers market is just amazing. But not all the time. Like sometimes on Saturday mornings, I just want to curl up in my bed and like eat breakfast and watch Netflix during the morning because my regulatory patterns are set up for that time. So you can use this, if you create these different visual spaces, it helps with sensory regulation, and children have the ability to be able to go through each of them depending on what visually works best for them at that time. This is just another example of a complex visual environment. Okay, so we're going to take a quick little visual break here. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to have you just for like 30 seconds, take your hands, cup them so that you can't see any light. And then what you're going to do is keep your eyes open, but put your hands over your eyes and keep your eyes open, but you should not be able to see any light. And if you count to 30 while you do that, and I'm going to keep talking here, but if you count to 30 while you do that, and you come back to the screen, I want you to see what you notice.
Why they got me in driving mode? I'm not driving.
Okay, I'm going to have you come back and see what you notice. Usually when people do this, colors look a little bit more clear, your eyes feel a little bit more reset, and you feel better able to kind of move on. This is a quick and easy visual break. If you've been working on the computer a lot, if we've been on the computer now for about 40 minutes, if you're doing those things, make sure that you're taking those breaks. Or if the kids are running around and it's one of those days and you just feel like you're herding cats all the time, like taking this little visual break for yourself can help to reset your sensory system. Okay, now that we've talked about space, we're going to talk about visual details within the space. These are exactly what I just said. They are details. And so again, like thinking about your environment and what works best for you is going to be the most important. But if you create those spaces, then thinking about the little details that you offer from a visual perspective can make or break it when it comes to kids' regulatory function. So sometimes doing something as simple as covering a shelf can make the difference for a child who is hypersensitive not have a meltdown, right? Or prevent a meltdown. or because what happens with visual processing is that it builds. So the more that we have, we might start off in the morning and be okay-ish, but the more visual demand that we have in the day without breaks can make a difference. So hopefully some of these details help to give you some ideas of how to use that visual information in your environment or minimize it, right? So the first thing is around accessibility. So around shelf. Sorry, it's about shelving, but shelving, the first thing we want to think about with shelving is accessibility, that children are able to reach all different levels of the shelves that their equipment and their toys are on. And usually I'm a fan of a group of 3. So not much more than 3 things on a shelf. Again, if a child is a little bit older, they might be able to handle more visual complexity, but something like this would be perfect for like a 1-year-old, right? We want to offer them ideas and things, but we don't want to offer them too much because they can't, because remember where they are developmentally, they're starting to aid in complexity, but not to the extent that adult would be. This is an example of that, right? Like the shelf on the left could potentially be appropriate for like a kindergartner or a first grader, but like it might be too complex for a preschooler or for sure like a 1-year-old, right? There's just too many options, too many things for them to see. Whereas on the right, there's a little bit like there's a little bit more organization to what that looks like. A little bit more accessibility. The next thing that I recommend, and this is my favorite, is transitional furniture. So making sure that your environment can be adaptive. You can move things. These little couches here are called nuggets, and you can turn them into couches, you can turn them into forts, you can turn them into obstacle courses. You can do all these different things with them. But it's multifunctional. So you can turn it into whatever it is that you need it to be, or you can put them away to the side if the visual environment is too complex. Kind of like putting canisters in the bottom of shelves or things like that. Just being able to move things around. Because what that does is it creates this. So like the example on the left, this is the same exact classroom. The example on the left is like, right, more visually complex. There's obviously a task out there that the kids are doing, so they're kind of going into more of their brain power phase. But because all of these things are movable and stackable and you can get them out of the way, you can create a whole different environment that looks very different visually, right? So offering gross motor types of things within the environment is really helpful. Labeling. So these might look like the same, right? But if you notice that the containers on the left are like opaque with the picture on the front, the ones on the right are clear with the picture on the front, right? Both great ideas. But I hope you can see now that like for a child who's visually hypersensitive, it might be more difficult for them to be able to select a toy or to figure out what they want from the shelf on the right versus the shelf on the left, because the visual complexity is just a little bit more, and that little bit makes all of the difference. Sometimes I have teachers do this like during nap times or during circle times or during times where like it's like taking all the toys out may not be an option, meal times, things like that. And they take the same containers and they flip them around. Because then what it does is 2 things. It signals to the kids like, oh, it might not be time to use these toys right now, but it also creates more of a plain visual environment, even though it's still colorful, right? So it can be both. Covering shelves. This is like one of the things I probably recommend the most when I go into childcare settings is simple Velcro or a tension rod with a curtain over it is a really easy way to minimize the visual environment. I once did a consultation where the teacher was talking to me and she was like, I'm trying to read to the kids and we're trying to make these transitions and the kids just keep pulling the things off the shelves. And all she did was this, and it stopped, right? Doesn't always happen that magically, but out of sight, out of mind sometimes, especially for children, especially for younger children. So again, during nap time and things like that, covering those areas helps to create a less stimulating environment. This is just another example of classroom that had done that in that way. art displays and learning. We, of course, want to see all of the beautiful artwork that the children make. And I think that it's really important to think about, number one, what's most important for the children to see. Number two, what is important for you to be seen, and what you would like the parents to see, right? And so when we do that, like thinking about definable, predictable areas where the art can be really helpful. So like in this environment, you can see like there's a lot of things happening here on the wall. And I'm, when I look at this, I'm like, what is it most important that the children focus on? And this could work for a lot of kids, especially kids who are hyposensitive. They're going to take in all of this, and they're going to really, it'll work for them. But you see the difference in this environment versus the other one. Like in this one, I look at this and I'm like, oh, clearly they want me to see all of the beautiful artwork that the children have displayed, right? It's more evident what it is that I think we could be visually focusing on. And that's, again, it's just different. It's just a difference of what you want to have as the visual focus. Sometimes what I do is I get on the floor and I crawl around rooms, because what that does is it gives me a better idea of what the children will be seeing and what's important to them. And then the last two things I'll just note is lighting. So natural light whenever we have the opportunity to, and using transitional lighting, so lighting that can be dimmed or anything like that. If that's not possible in your home, and you have like a basement like I do that has like fluorescent lighting, these little covers you can get from Amazon. They're not very expensive, and they knock down all of the like waves that you would see potentially from fluorescent lighting. And then just thinking about use of color. So this is actually from Monet's house in Paris, but not my picture that I took, but thinking about how color impacts mood and environment. So stimulating colors would be red and oranges and yellows. Soothing, calming colors are blues and greens, purples, more subtle colors. So thinking about what you want to evoke in your environment, and then using a color that would match the pattern that you're, or the activity or the event that usually occurs in that group. Okay. Questions? I threw a lot at you all. Like, I know that I just threw a lot at you all, but hopefully, if anybody has any questions here, feel free to ask. And I also, on the next slide, I do have my contact information. If there's anything that, if you have a burning question or you want to think through something, I would be more than happy to connect outside of this presentation.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. This was so informational. You gave so many strategies, sent them our way. Thank you so much for your time and effort on this.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So what is the effect if you have a kid who is hyposensitive, like visually? What is the effect if you have like a very minimalistic environment?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So if you're noticing that you have a child who's more hyposensitive, like they're always seeking things, they're always looking for bright colors and bright lights and things like that, it might be things as simple as like providing bigger, like bright colors for them, or like different patterns and bright colors, or offering them more opportunity to get outside and have more complexity in their visual environment, because that's what they might be seeking. Also, like depending on the child's age and what the activity is that you're engaging in, it could be something like these might be children who, okay, I'm just going to think of like a 5-year-old who, if you're reading a book to or something like that, they might be like, touching things and pulling up things and trying to like look at the book while you're doing it, giving them something that they can look at while they're listening. So those like little oil and water toys, right? Or the old school, like those little bubble things where you push it and like the balls come up and then they land in the little nets and whatever. Like, I don't know what they're called, but they're awesome. Like giving children more of that stimulation in those ways can be helpful. So you would adapt it to the task that they're engaged in. Does that help?
Yeah, I just, was thinking about the negatives of having a minimalistic environment, but it
Yeah.
sounds like you can create smaller, more stimulating things for those children.
Exactly. Or even if you have a couple of kids and the environment is more minimalistic, again, like the hive example might be one of those places too, because they're that I showed from Denise, like where there's a lot of different paintings on the wall, like, right, there is a little bit more stimulation in an environment that's a little bit more like where, oh, if I want a little bit more, but yet I still kind of want that parent space, I could do something like that. Or you could use color in that way. For that child in that way. So like having them do something like if again, like I'm just trying to think, like a brighter colored blanket that you pull them in on the floor or something like that could also help with that visual stimulation as well. Yeah. A great question. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Gretchen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to send the evaluation link one more time because I am going to end our meeting for today. So I want to make sure you click on that. It should be highlighted in blue so that you can open it up on another screen. This is how we know who attended today's event. And thank you so much again, Gretchen. This is
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.